I can relate. We hear that and say that quite often. Someone tells us a story about something going on in their lives. Oh, I can relate, and then we give a similar story that happened to us. Or sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes someone tells us something that's going on that we can't even imagine. I can't relate, but I try and empathize. I try and express some degree of solidarity, perhaps. But we use this, at least idea, maybe not these exact words, a lot. Especially with those that we are close with, those that we are trying to develop close relationships with. We want to try and relate to them. You probably are aware, as we think about the word itself, there is obviously a connection between the idea of relate and relationship, right? We have an idea of trying to have some degree of commonality, perhaps. But I want us to think this morning, for just a few minutes, especially in light of what we're doing this morning with Involvement Sunday and everything like that, about what it means to relate to everyone. What it means to relate as we are trying to be involved, as we are trying to be, in particular, engaged in the act of evangelism, that is, reaching those who are in need of the gospel of Christ. Well, how do I relate to them? There are a lot of people in this world. There are a lot of different kinds of people in this world. And by that, I don't mean perhaps those who live in different places or ethnicities or cultures or anything like that. I'm talking just about life experience. I'm just talking about things that people go through, things that people experience in their everyday lives. There's a lot of people. Most of them have experiences very different from what I do. That's just the nature of life. We're all very different. So how can I relate? It's easy, isn't it, to relate to those who are like me? In fact, we often find in settings such as this that many of the people in this room have a lot of similarities to me. What about when I'm trying to reach those that aren't so similar? How do I relate? Well, first of all, we need to ask the question, what does it really mean to relate to someone? When I say we need to relate, what does it really mean to actually connect with someone? Is it just a feeling of connection? Is it some magical formula where we feel like we're connecting, or we feel like we are relating to them, or they feel like we're relating to them? Well, I want to throw out a couple of examples, what I would argue are examples of this kind of idea in Scripture. First of all, I want us to think about, as we've been talking through the book of Acts, how almost every lesson, certainly in the first 10 chapters of the book of Acts, begins. It has something to do with our common history as Jews. Peter usually, sometimes Stephen, as we talked about this morning, or others, they give a presentation of the gospel, and most of it tends to center around the common Jewish heritage of the speaker and the audience. We've talked about in class, why is it that men like Peter or Stephen or others, Paul later on as he's speaking to Jews at times, why do they always bring up the God of our fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob? Is it so that they can just simply reiterate what they all are already on the same page about? It's to point out that we have common ground. It's to point out that we're not all that different, you and I. Not only in general, we're all human beings, but even in what we believe. Now it's interesting. Even when you have Paul, for example, speaking to those who don't have the common Jewish background, do you notice he still finds some common ground? In Acts 17, for example, I was walking around looking at all the objects of your worship. I found this inscription, to the unknown God. But even before the unknown God part, which I would argue is still a degree of common ground, let me tell you about this God, because it's the same God I worship. Hey, we worship the same God. But what he actually does, even in the beginning, you remember that first statement he makes? I perceive that you are very pious. In other words, you care about religious matters. That's commendable. I do too. Now again, of course, he is taking them from where they are, which is in error, to where they need to be. He's not saying we're on the same page or I worship this God in the sense of I worship some random idol that's called the unknown God. He's applying it to the true God. Let me tell you about this unknown God, because clearly you don't know him. I do. And let me tell you. Common ground. We also see something else when it comes to this idea of relating. Remember one of the accusations against Jesus as he is doing his ministry throughout the area of Judea, Galilee, etc. Jesus notes as he is facing opposition from the Jewish leadership, he notes that whenever John the Baptist came before him, that people said, he must be possessed with a demon. He doesn't eat, he doesn't drink, he lives in the wilderness, he wears camel skin. What a weirdo, right? And then, as soon as Jesus comes along, he does eat, he does drink. And they say, look, a glutton, a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Now, I want us to note not just the hypocrisy of the Jewish leadership at this, but especially I want us to note what Jesus is actually doing. Was Jesus a glutton and a drunkard? Well, no, clearly. Was he a friend of tax collectors and sinners? Well, what do we mean by that? Did Jesus eat with tax collectors and sinners? Absolutely. Something that was completely taboo for the faithful Jews of the time, at least according to their traditions. What was he doing? The accusation, you see, was that he was spending time with them to engage in the activities that they were engaged in. That is, the illicit, the sinful activities that they were engaged in. That he was somehow approving of the sin, of the corruption. What was Jesus doing? We all need to eat. So why don't I take this time to do something that isn't wrong with those who, yes, aren't living right, so that I can not only have some common ground. We're all human. We all need to eat. We all have these times where we can share some kind of commonality, but also to show that he cared. Also to show a degree of recognition, I care about you too. I don't just care about the ones who have most of the things in their lives right. I care about the ones who are shunned by society. Doesn't mean there aren't things they need to fix. Doesn't mean there aren't things everyone needs to fix, as he very bluntly oftentimes points out to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I love, for example, you don't know either the Scriptures or the power of God. That's a very blunt statement to make to the people who are supposed to be the religious authorities of his day. He's making that statement because he's pointing out all of you need God, need salvation, have a sin problem. That's why I'm here. But he ate with the tax collectors and sinners, again, to find common ground and to show he cared. Of course, a discussion of the fact that Jesus cared about others would be remiss if we don't talk about the death of Lazarus. Lazarus approaches the grave. Many are weeping. This is a multi-day practice in their culture of mourning the death of a loved one. He's been buried for a few days now. You know, typically we have a funeral, maybe a visitation, and it's kind of over with after they're in the ground. This was much more extended in their culture. So everyone's gathered around. Lazarus has been dead for days. But notice what we're told. Jesus sees his friends, Mary, Martha, and he sees all the others weeping. We're told he is deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now I want to ask you, at this juncture, do you think Jesus doesn't know what he's about to do? You think Jesus doesn't know that he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead? Why is he troubled? Why is he grieved in his spirit? You know, there have been times where I wondered if part of this was, well, Lazarus has escaped this world, I have to bring him back. But the text indicates, and maybe that's part of it too, but the text says when he saw all these other people weeping, he's not thinking about Lazarus per se at this moment, he's thinking about everyone else. And what is his response? He says, "Where have you laid him?" They say, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. Notice the response of the Jews. See how he loved him. Jesus cared. Jesus showed that he cared. And I don't mean that he put on a show. He wept because, as we were just told, he is deeply troubled in spirit. Why? Because people around him are grieving. So I would argue, as we talk about relating to others, both of these elements have to be brought into play. For our purposes, when I say relate, I mean we're finding common ground and showing others that we care. Those are the two elements, I would argue, we have to combine if we're talking about relating to someone else. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if we're talking about relating, and we're talking about getting involved in the act of evangelism and ministering and reaching those who need the gospel, and we start thinking about all the different people that means we would have to interact with. Those who have certainly different religious views, that kind of goes without saying. Those who perhaps have different political views. Those who might have different values. Those who might have vastly different and even sinful lifestyles. Well, yes, I need to preach the truth. I need to teach the truth to them. But do I have to relate to them too? Do I really have to? Isn't it enough for me to just present the truth? I don't have to actually try and develop a relationship. I don't actually try and get close to them or connect with them in any way. I just need to give them the truth, don't I? Isn't that really all that's actually required of me? We're told in Matthew 28, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." He continues in verse 20, "Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." Make disciples. None of us are exempt from that commandment. I hope we all understand that. All of us are expected, are required, are commanded to be involved in evangelism, sharing the gospel with a lost and dying world. That's our job. That's what we signed up for as Christians. We didn't sign up simply to sit on a pew. We didn't sign up simply to be consumers of an organization called the church. We signed up to work. But what does it take to make disciples? That word is actually very interesting. It's not a simple word. Make followers. Make those who are committed. Now, what's the best way to teach someone? What's the best way to help someone become something that they need to be? You can ask anyone who's done any form of teaching in any professional setting, and they will tell you, you're not going to be effective if you can't relate to your class, if you can't relate to those who you are trying to teach. If there's no connection there, if there is this removal between you and those you are trying to teach, you're not going to be effective. That's just common sense, quite frankly. But maybe we say, well, that's true, but the gospel is what really matters. And you're right. The truth is what will convict. And you're right. But let's think about the one who came to give us the gospel. Did he feel the need to try and relate to those that he was trying to teach? Well, we've already seen some examples of that, but I want to give us something even more. The book of Hebrews is wonderful. I love the book of Hebrews so much. One of the things that the writer of Hebrews is having to combat at this time is a denial of exactly who Jesus was. Perhaps the beginnings even of the idea that perhaps Jesus wasn't really God in the flesh. Either he might have been man or he might have been God. We see this idea that develops even more after the destruction of Jerusalem. We see it especially reflected in the books of John and others. But as the Hebrews writer is writing, defending the idea that Jesus is both God and man, notice what he says in chapter 2 and verse 17. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers. Jesus had to be made like mankind in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and a faithful high priest. If you're not familiar with the role of a high priest, they were the ones who were the mediator, the connection between God and man. A human being doing that is rather imperfect, because he can represent humans well, but he can't really represent God very well. He is a human himself with sins, unless you're talking about one who is both human and divine. That made Jesus different from all the other priests that had gone before. In order to be that perfect high priest, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. In other words, on a fundamental, existential level, Jesus became not just one who could relate to us, he became one of us. Not in any way sacrificing his divinity, not in any way changing the fact that he is God, but he became human. Now, we talk about relating to others, finding common ground. You know, there's a lot of people it's hard to find common ground with as Christians, or just as people in general, from a personality standpoint, all sorts of different factors. It's hard to find common ground. There's also people it's hard, quite frankly, to care for. Some who are rebellious against God and his word. Some who are so caught up in sin that they treat those around them with anything but love. It's hard to respond to that with care, with concern, with true affection, with love. Do you think it was hard for the second person of the Godhead, who has been equal with God in heaven since time began and forever before that? You think it was hard for him to interact with man? You think it was hard for him to find common ground with us? You think it was hard for him to care about those who over and over and over and over again had spat in his face when it comes to who he created them to be? And guess what his response was to that? To become one of us so he could do just that. Relate to us. The Hebrews writer goes on in Hebrews 4. Man, there's so much. I would just love to read this whole section of Hebrews 4. But we're told we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Do we realize what it means that Jesus subjected himself to being tempted? We're told God cannot be tempted with evil. That's why he had to become man. When he became man, he experienced something he had never experienced before. He could now be tempted. Do you realize what God did for us in doing that? Why? We could say, well, he had to face temptation so he could overcome it and be our perfect sacrifice. That's true. We could say, well, he had to experience that so that he could show it could be done, and that we are responsible for our own sins because we always have a way of escape, as Paul tells us in Corinthians. That's also true. But I would argue that's not the end of the story. He is able to sympathize with us because of this. He can relate. He's been there in every way, in every possible sphere of temptation that you and I experience, even in the modern day with all the changes between our culture and the culture that Jesus lived in. He still experienced every form of temptation that we still experience. And so when we say, this is hard, when we say, I'm struggling, when we say, Lord, I don't know if I can do this, Jesus can honestly respond and say, I can relate. I've been where you are. I've experienced what you experience, and by the way, let's be honest, and far more. So do I really have to relate to others? Well, Jesus did everything within his power without ever taking any form of sin or wrongdoing on, but everything else he possibly could to say, I'm one of you. We have common ground. I care about you. And if Jesus was willing to do that for me, then yes, I don't have an excuse. I do have to be willing to do that for others. Because Jesus knew that was the only way that he would be most effective in reaching man who was lost. And the same is true for us. Yes, if I don't try and relate to someone and I simply present them with the gospel, maybe, despite my failings, maybe they will still obey the truth. It's far more likely if I try and find that common ground, if I get outside my comfort zone, if I seek to show, and not simply as an outward show that's not sincere, but truly demonstrate because it's real that I care about the soul in front of me, I will be much more likely to succeed. They will be much more likely to listen. The phrase often repeated is nevertheless true. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. If I don't try and relate, yeah, that makes it easier on me. It does. It's a lot easier to be distant from those we're trying to reach. But that's not what I'm called to do. This is my commandment, Jesus says, that you love one another as I have loved you. If there was any ambiguity, if there's any confusion about whether or not we're supposed to go to the same lengths Jesus went to, this sums it up. You love one another as best as you can, getting as close as you can, but you're never going to be me. That's not what he says. Now that's true, nonetheless. Despite our best efforts, we're not going to be perfect like Jesus was. But that doesn't mean we ever get to stop short willfully of doing our best to be like Jesus was. If God was willing to relate to us so that we could be saved, we should be willing to relate to others so that they can too. But as we begin to wrap up, I want us to consider on a more practical level, what does it take? What does it take to relate to others? We talked about what it means to relate to others, but what does it really take? What does it require of me to do this? Again, there are so many different kinds of people with so many different life experiences and so many obstacles to connecting. What does it take to relate? Well, first of all, we all have one thing in common. We all have sinned. I don't care how much growth you have experienced as you are sitting here in this auditorium as a Christian. Perhaps you've been a Christian for many, many years. You have put so many sins behind you. You have grown so much closer to God in your life. The fact remains that you have sinned. And I would venture to bet that you probably still at times struggle with that in your life. Because we're told that if we say we have no sin, we make him a liar. We're never going to reach the point of perfection. We've never arrived. We always are continuing to grow. I have that in common with those around me, whoever they are. I don't care what form of sin it is. Now, sometimes we take this too far and say all sins are equal in the sense of the consequences of all sins are equal or something like that. That's not what we're talking about. But no matter what the sin is, it's enough to separate us from God. So I don't care who I'm talking to. We have that in common. And I Must not allow any sort of pride or anything that would permit me not to admit that, even to those who might genuinely be far deeper in sin than I am. But it comes back to the heart. So much of it comes back to the heart. And I don't mean the fuzzy feelings. I mean who I am at my core, my motivations. Paul says, do nothing. Maybe a few things. No. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. We all have comfort zones. We're not talking about safety, right? I'm not saying just waltz into a gang hideout on the border or something like that. But when it comes to comfort zones, we all have those. Things that we don't want to step out of, things that we don't like doing. Comfort zones are not easy to overcome. I have comfort zones. I don't like getting out of them. I'm saying this just as much to myself as to anyone else. But I do want us to be very clear. Friends, if my comfort zone keeps me from doing something that would help someone else go to heaven, that is on me. I have to live with that. You have to live with that. I should be putting others far above any consideration of my own comfort zone. We read a little while ago Paul's synopsis of this sentiment. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Some have taken this to say Paul was a good old boy throwing back beers with the other people. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying he engaged in the things that others were doing that he was trying to help them out of. He's saying, in every possible way that I could relate to someone, that I could find common ground and show them I care without violating anything that is a matter of right or wrong, I was willing to do it. When I was around Gentiles, I conformed to their habits and their customs as long as they were not in opposition to God. When I was around Jews, I was sensitive to their scruples as the things that they were used to. I went outside my comfort zone. I did things I wouldn't normally do. Not because I was being fake, not because I was being a poser, because I was trying to remove every possible obstacle between that soul and the gospel of Christ. There are a lot of people we're not going to have much in common with, but we can find something. We might not want to. Their hobbies might not be our hobbies. Their lifestyle might not be our lifestyle. We can find something. We might not enjoy being around them. Again, we're not talking about safety here. That has to be considered in certain situations. But I'm talking about, I just don't enjoy their company. So because of that, I'm not going to give them the opportunity, to the best of my ability, to learn the life-saving message that will get them to heaven. I can find something. I can find something. Rejoice with those who rejoice, Paul says in Romans. Weep with those who weep. It's so easy to distance ourselves. Honestly, that's especially true with social media, with the internet, with things like that. It's easy to separate ourselves from the humanity of those we interact with. When someone's hurting, it's also easy to try and distance myself because I don't want to hurt too. It's not fun. Again, when we're talking with the guys at school, one of the things we tell them is that you have to be aware, if you truly care about the people in your congregation or the people in whatever work you're involved in, you're going to get hurt a lot. You're going to get hurt a lot because you hurt when they're hurting. You're going to get hurt a lot because they make decisions you tried to warn them not to make. You get hurt a lot because sometimes they don't treat you the way they should. We try and warn them about all these things. It's just part of the nature of the work of ministry, and honestly, part of the nature of being a Christian at all. And so sometimes the instinct is to pull away, to not make the connections in the first place, then you don't get hurt. Jesus wept. I must care. It's going to hurt. It's going to take effort to work through the emotional burden at times of trying to show my care, especially when I'm trying to reach those with the gospel. You know how much it hurts when you do your absolute best to try and show someone what they need to do to be saved and they don't listen? And you think maybe they're coming around, then it hurts. It should. Because that means that I care. Whatever might get in the way. Pride, selfishness, a desire not to feel with others because it's too much. It doesn't matter what the obstacle is. I have to replace all of that with love. That's God's motivation. It should be mine. I want to understand others. I want to feel for and with others. I want to find common ground with others so that they will be most inclined to listen when I share with them the message that someone else was willing to share with me. We're having a day today where we're talking about ways we can get involved. As we already mentioned, that's not really optional. I'm not talking about any particular work. I'm not talking about any particular amount of work. Each of us have different things we can offer. Each of us have different responsibilities in other areas. But we don't have the option of doing some kind of work in the kingdom or not. But even if we're working, we've got to make sure that we're working for the right reasons, with the right heart, that we are trying to reach those that need the gospel. Not just checking a box, doing something, okay, I've done my part. I'm doing it because I care about the souls that Christ died for. If I want to be effective in reaching people, I must be willing to try and relate. Perhaps that's something that you've been struggling with. Perhaps you've been a Christian for a long time and maybe you have experienced the pain that goes with trying to relate to others and you begin to distance yourself. It does take effort and intentionality to work through those feelings. It does, trust me. But the answer is not to shut yourself off. The answer is actually to love more. Perhaps you haven't been involved in the work of reaching others with the gospel in the way that you know you should. I imagine many of us, if not all of us, have been there. But the harvest is white. The laborers are few. We need you. Jesus needs you in his kingdom. And people need to know that someone cares. Our society is begging for people to just show they care. Maybe these areas are things that you recognize you haven't been doing as you should. We encourage you, it's not too late to change that mindset, to rededicate yourself to the work. We would love to encourage you, to pray with you, to help you, to work alongside you in that process. Or perhaps you're here this morning and you have never made the commitment to be part of the kingdom in the first place. You've never repented, put your old life behind, died to your old self in the waters of baptism because of your faith in Christ. We would love to share the message with you that others have shared with us. Because more than anything else, in every relationship we have, we want everyone we come in contact with to be in heaven one day. If we can help you in any way, please let us know as we stand, as we sing together.